UF will be taking on the Seminoles in just a few days. But much like the Gators, the Noles are going to be without their starting quarterback. I'm joined tonight by Kevin Little of X's and Noles and Noles 247. Kevin, thanks for joining me today. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing about as well as you can be after Saturday, but yeah, doing well, all things considered. Thanks.
Saturday night was devastating for both of our fan bases. Likely more so for FSU fans, just mainly because of what they still have to play for and how long Jordan has been with the program. You've had a couple days to digest it. Want to talk to you a little bit. How much did Jordan mean to this team?
Yeah, so Jordan was more of an embodiment of the program. So the feeling of him going down was less sadness. I mean, obviously he's a great player. He was in Heisman conversation. I don't think anybody had realistic hopes that he was going to win that or anything, but he was a good enough player to at least be thrown into that conversation. But really where the kind of shame and the sadness came is that Jordan Travis has been there along the way, right? He was a transfer that was brought in by Willie Taggart. He was a part of that crew. He scored a touchdown his first play as a part of Willie Taggart's team. Actually, the game after Willie Taggart was fired, he scored a touchdown on his first play. And he's kind of just been there. He's been kind of an embodiment of the grind, the growth that you've seen going from kind of the lowest Florida State's been in 50 years
Mhm.
to kind of getting back up to where FSU expects to be as a program. And he's been a leader the whole way. Who's a guy that wanted to quit when Mike Norvell showed up. He convinced him to stay on, and you've obviously from the Florida perspective, you've seen the growth in him
Mhm.
secondhand, and from a Florida State perspective, he's really just embodied, where the program is as a whole.
Tate Rodemaker is his backup. He led a comeback against Louisville, which is a team he's going to see next week as well, but he led that comeback last season. He also got most of the reps on Saturday night. What are some of your high level thoughts on Tate?
Yeah, so I've been a fan of Tate since day one. He was a kind of middling 3-star recruit. He was Mike Norvell's first recruit that he signed up 3 years ago. And he's a guy that has great arm talent. So that's kind of where you want to start with Tate Rodemaker. He can make any throw on the field. Honestly, if I were being completely straightforward, he has an NFL arm.
Mhm.
He's more athletic than you would think he is. He runs a 4.6 40, can do a standing backflip, that kind of stuff. He stands at 6'4".
We had a
The
quarterback
big
that could do that once.
wait, what?
I said we had a quarterback who could do that once,
Oh yeah, yeah, but
which got in trouble for doing it last
oh
season.
really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so but you don't really see it on the field as much, right? So
Yeah.
he's kind of got the long speed more than he's got the agility in the pocket. So from an outsider's perspective, I wouldn't blame any Florida fan or even many casual FSU fans for claiming that he's a statue in the pocket. He kind of gives that impression. Um, the real question is what's between his ears, right? So made some he got some early snaps as a true freshman, made some kind of freshman mistakes, made some mistakes the subsequent spring game that kind of didn't stand well in the minds of Florida State fans. And, in the college game, when every loss matters, there's been a lot of apprehension about a guy that, can make a lot of throws.
Sure.
But I mean, you saw with Richardson, sometimes these guys that are NFL kind of talents, like have the high end physical capabilities. If they're going to throw an interception or two, that could lose you a game in a season where, unlike the NFL, you really can't afford to lose a game. So that's a big question with him.
So on the road at Louisville on a Friday night isn't exactly the same as playing in the swamp, particularly on a Saturday night, right? But do
Yeah,
you think that that experience from last year is going to help him on Saturday?
you would hope so from a Florida State perspective. I think it's easy to discount Louisville. Louisville, they're not the most prestigious program. That defense was decent. They ended up on SP Plus as the number 14th best defense in the country last year. So they were a decent squad, but of course, there's always concerns about the swamp. Ben Hill Griffin is one of the hardest places to play in the country. Getting his first true start since his freshman year when he played Jacksonville State. So yeah, that's a huge concern. It's a huge concern how he's going to handle that pressure if that old freshman mistake
Mhm.
comes back to haunt Florida State. Because, with the way rivalries are, oftentimes one or two mistakes are kind of what dictates the whole game.
All right, guys, we'll get right back to Kevin in a minute, but I just wanted to remind you, huge tailgate on Saturday at the Swamp. You guys know you want to come out, hang out with me, watch football. There's going to be food, there's going to be booze, there's going to be lots and lots of fun football talk. You can find a link to get the tickets in the description of this video. Come hang out with me on game day. It's going to be so fun. Jordan developed pretty insanely last year. Well, I mean, over the course of his career as a passer. But I think what UF fans were probably most worried about from last season were his legs. What is Tate's mobility like?
Yeah, so that's the big question, right? That's kind of how you separate the people that have been around the program from probably the people who haven't watched
Mhm.
Tate outside of a few snaps in spring games, which, to be fair, isn't necessarily their fault. Tate has mobility. I think he doesn't have pocket presence. And
Okay.
that's where he might run into some trouble, and where I think he's getting the criticism that he might be immobile, because frankly, Jordan Travis, what he did better than anybody was, evade pressure in the pocket. I think he covered a lot of gaps in where our offensive line is. He
Mhm.
made them look a lot better than they are, just because he was slippery in the pocket, hard to bring down. So that is a big concern. Whether or not Tate's pocket awareness is where it needs to be, because I have a feeling if he gets in space, if there's a situation where he pulls a read option and he gets 10 yards downfield and there's not much there. I mean, he's been clocked at 20 plus miles per hour running a 4.6. So he's got the long speed. But the first 5 yards are the most important yards in football. And I don't necessarily know if he has that first 5 yards.
So is that what you are the most worried about with him?
It's definitely the mistakes. I mean, you saw in UNA, he held the ball for upwards of 5 seconds, which resulted in a sack fumble that
Mhm.
FSU was fortunate to recover. So if you see something like that happen, I mean, he held the ball on average over 3 seconds against North Alabama and against Louisville last year, which is a really long time to throw.
Mhm.
So that just puts extra pressure on the offensive line and increases chances that you're going to get some sort of sack, some sort of fumble. And like I said, those mistakes are things that can dictate a game.
So do you think that UF will try and put more pressure on him than they maybe would have with Jordan Travis?
Uh, it's funny because that's the first instinct, right? The first instinct to say, well, he's going to be less mobile. Let's put some pressure on him. Let's blitz him. Let's attack him. And I think there's some wisdom to that. He had some trouble recognizing blitz against UNA. There was one or two sacks that kind of came down to him not seeing his hot route because he didn't recognize those pressures. I think Norvell's going to kind of throw in a lot of RPOs and a lot of screens to try to mitigate that if that is Florida's game plan. But over the UNA game and the Louisville game, what you actually saw, because I mean Jordan played almost the first half of the Louisville game and pretty much the first quarter of the UNA game, is that both of those teams decided to take players out of the box when Tate Rodemaker came into the game. They took players out of run fits because the threat over the top became more important with him in the game because of his arm strength. So that'll be an interesting thing to see how uh, Florida tries to deal with that.
Florida also will be starting a backup quarterback, and Max Brown is certainly more of an unknown than Tate Rodemaker. But do you have any early thoughts on him, or have you done any scouting there at all?
Yeah, I've watched Max Brown. He's a decently electric player. I think he made some throws in the Missouri game that I probably wouldn't have thought were in him, and he made them decently consistent. And so that was an impressive little outing for him. In a high pressure environment, he's obviously got decent legs. He pulled a couple against Missouri, who I really don't think was expecting him to be as mobile as he was. There was a read option where I think Missouri was hoping their defensive end could cover both the cutback lane for the running back and the quarterback, and Max Brown kind of outran him. They
Yeah.
didn't, they just didn't have enough guys there to take away the run. They were still in Graham Mertz territory, and so they kind of surprised him there. And if you're going to try to hurt this Florida State defense, it's going to come with a mobile quarterback. I mean, that's where they've struggled all year. If you're going to say that this top 10 unit has struggled anywhere.
Rodemaker's experience and his arm talent versus Max Brown being a dual threat quarterback and also an unknown. Very, very little film to be found on him. Which team has the advantage there?
I mean, I think if you're being realistic, you look at, wins above replacement. Jordan Travis was, I don't think many people would argue, was a top 10 quarterback. And as high as I am on Tate Rodemaker, he's not there, right? I think he has this tools that if everything were to go perfectly, he kind of opens things up for the offense, but he's not a top 10 quarterback. Graham Mertz was way more than I think anybody was expecting at UF. I do think that offensive staff did a really good job of making him comfortable, getting him completions, kind of scheming to make him to kind of utilize his strengths. But I think that's something that can be replaced a little bit easier than kind of what Jordan Travis was giving you. Generally, if you're a coach and you have an inexperienced quarterback, that little bit of mobility kind of gives some flexibility to game planning. And so I do think, if I were to be making odds before and after both injuries, Florida's odds are a little bit better than they were before the injuries.
All right, let's talk a little bit more general now. Do you have a favorite memory from this rivalry?
Yeah. So I believe it was 2004, 2005. Chris Ricks threw a touchdown to PK Sam in the end zone to win it. So that's probably my favorite. That was like the formative memory.
It had to be 2004 because they definitely won 2005, 2006.
Yeah. So I was to age myself here. I was
Actually,
going
it was
through
2003. That was my freshman
2003.
year of
Yeah.
college.
So that would have
Yes,
been an early memory for me.
that,
Yeah. So
honey, is the swindle in the swamp.
yeah, that was great. Yeah. So I didn't have a name for it. So that's kind of where I'm at. But yeah, I was 8 years
Y'all
old.
got some
So
ref helping. That's why there hasn't been ACC officials for a long time. Our old offensive coordinator literally banned them from being able. It was written in the contract, and Scott Strickland, new athletic director, took it out. But so the ACC officials that'll be there on Saturday, that's the first time in a very long time that there have been ACC officials in the swamp.
look, I will never defend ACC officials. So we can move on from that.
SEC either, so
Yeah.
they're just terrible. But what's your least favorite memory?
Oh man. Yeah, really the only time I've ever been mad at Bobby Bowden was watching Tim Tebow led Gators just walk up and down Doak Campbell Stadium. So those weren't good times for Florida State fans, as a young Nole watching with some Florida fans and Georgia Tech fans. Those were not fun Mondays to come back to in middle school. So
Oh, middle
um,
school, you just aged me so much. Oh.
yeah. So those are
Well,
my least favorite.
favorite. Well, 2004 at Doak Campbell Stadium, that was the day that they dedicated Bobby Bowden Field. And
Mm,
Ron Zook had already been notified that he was fired for Florida. But my husband played for Florida during this time. He was my
okay,
boyfriend at the time. But
cool.
Florida beat Florida State the night they dedicated Bobby Bowden Field. So Ron Zook was carried off on the shoulders of his players while all of the Florida fans that were still there chanted Ron Zook Field. And that has
That's
to
not a good
be
look.
one of my all-time favorite Florida State memories. But
Yeah.
beating y'all for a national championship didn't suck either.
Yeah, I was luckily too young to remember that one.
I was in 5th grade
Well,
when
there
that
you go.
happened,
That was
and definitely remember it. All right, let's talk big picture for a minute.
okay.
Florida State's defense has been pretty good all season, especially in the second half of games. UF's offense has been a little bit more effective in 5 of their last 6 games. They've been scoring over 30 points against everybody but Georgia. Florida State's defense hasn't given up 30 all year.
Mhm.
So which trend or streak continues?
Um, I'm not low on the Florida's offense as I think you'll hear most FSU fans talking
Mhm.
smack. To be honest, I do think that they have a decent unit. I think F plus has them somewhere in the mid-20s, which is, to be honest, one of the better units that Florida State would have faced, at least on the offensive side this year. So I think there's some merit to them getting points on the board. If I were to guess, they're going to be around the 20 range at the end of the day. Um, I think that's kind of where both units sit. Like Florida State's, they've been good, but they haven't been elite at just shutting teams down. You're going to get a touchdown or two. There's going to be an explosive or two that happens. It's happened every game, or a drive or two that just kind of, I mean, that's really been the thing is once or twice a game, there'll be a drive where the opponent just runs down the field, gets a touchdown, and then has no more success for the rest of the game. So I think what you'll see is maybe a touchdown or two in the first half. So maybe 14 points in the first half, if I were to say. And then in the second half, Florida State generally, ties the screws down and kind of figures out what they want to do. They've been one of the best defenses in the country in the second half. So I think Florida will get some points. But I would be shocked if they got over 30 on this one. But I could be wrong here.
All right, let's stick with defense, but look at the other matchup. UF's defense has been abysmal. I mean, terrible. This is what all Florida fans are going to be complaining about, all offseason is Florida's defense. They've
Yes.
given up 30 plus points, 6 of their last 7 games. Florida State has scored more than 30 points in every game but Pitt and Miami. How do you think FSU's offense, obviously now with Tate at the helm, will potentially match up with UF's defense?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. And I think that Florida State matches up pretty well against Florida, at least on that side of the ball. So Florida, so to get into some like nitty gritty here, Florida doesn't do what's called well, they contain on counter plays. So they don't spill counter. And all that means is that when Florida State pulls linemen, they keep contained instead of trying to bust the play outside. Florida State's been a lot better at running their key play counter on teams that choose to play contain. It'll be interesting to see if Florida kind of changes that up, if they see that on tape and say, well, now we got to spill counter because we're playing this team that really struggles when teams want to spill counter. But if they're going to sit there and play contain, I think Florida State's going to be able to run the ball on them, and that's kind of dangerous. Florida's defensive line is big, but kind of slow, and I don't. I'm going to be honest. I don't think they're super well coached on that unit. They just catch a lot of blocks. They don't really attack well. They're not gap setters. And you saw it in the Kentucky game, which I think was just the extension of the problem where they just weren't able to get to the gaps. The secondary struggled tackling. And to be fair to Florida, I think they've faced a bevy of top 50 offenses that's kind of inflated the stats worse than they probably are. I think they're probably a top 60, 70 unit. And that's okay, but that's going to be one of the worst units that Florida State's played. They've played some decent defenses as of this year. And so if Florida's unable to stop the running game, then Florida State's going to just be able to run up and down the field. It doesn't matter if Tate Rodemaker's a quarterback. If they're able to stop that and maybe get some pressure, I think their best chance defensively is getting some turnovers, getting some mistakes. That's how Boston College was able to kind of stay in the game against Florida State, is just really trying to force those turnovers, whether it's adding blitzes or, kind of being funny with coverages. I know Florida loves to do different coverages. That doesn't mean they're necessarily great at all of them, but they like to throw different looks out there. And so maybe you can kind of get Tate to make a bad read and throw the ball into coverage. And I think what Florida has to hope is that they're going to be able to get some turnovers on that side of the ball.
So I've kind of asked this with my last two questions, and you've kind of answered it for me. But do you have a lean here or even a score prediction this early in the week?
I think Florida State still has the advantage on this one. To be honest, and I think it's going to be a sort of ugly game for a while. That's just kind of tended to be how Florida State's played this year. A lot of kind of back and forth in the first half, keeping the games close, and it
That's the
becomes
nature of
kind of a
this rivalry in general, too, though, right?
yeah. And Florida State, you know, they don't play their best games in the swamp, and no one does. I think they're still the better team. I think Florida's just too banged up on the defensive side of the ball. I think there's some things that you can exploit in Florida's defense. And Florida State has some weaknesses on the defensive side of the ball, mainly in their safeties. But I don't think that Brown is really the guy to take advantage of that. I think Florida State wins. I think it's closer than most Florida State fans would like. But I like Tate's experience. I like Florida State's team as it stands right now. I think they're a little bit better injury wise, and I think it's going to be a close game, and one that Florida State hopefully, from my perspective, comes out on top of.
All right, Kevin, I so appreciate you being willing to join me. Tell everybody where they can find your work, where they can follow you, all the good things.
Yeah, so I run a podcast mostly, or a video cast, a YouTube channel called X's and Noles. I try to do my best at analytically breaking down opponents and looking at film, trying to be very objective about it, but the bias creeps in every once in a while. So yeah, if you'll check me out over there, if you're interested at all at some of the opponents that we've faced, or just want to learn a little bit more about the X's and O's of football, that's where I'll be. And yeah, thanks for having me, Allie. I've had a good time.
I appreciate you, and go Gators.